As restrictions on freedom of speech continue to rise in the West, we focus on the politically influenced targeting of justice activists through their own professional bodies. Is this a new tactic being used by foreign powers and the Israeli lobby in particular, or is it being used by our own establishment too? Either way, threatening people's job security to silence them sets a very dangerous precedent for all of us. In December 2024, Dr. Rehiana Ali, an NHS-employed consultant neurologist, was given an 18-month suspension by the General Medical Council after complaints by an anti-Semitism campaign organisation called Nasha Jew. This case, and many others like it, raised serious questions about whether the GMC itself is upholding its mission to promote and protect the interests of doctors and patients. More broadly, we have to ask how vulnerable are Western professional institutions to the tactics of politically motivated groups who wish to silence and persecute NHS doctors and other public servants. Isn't it perfectly legitimate for people to exercise their right to express publicly their views on any matter of socio-political importance? Hello and welcome to this edition of the Deep Dive Perspective, a show in which we tackle really the toughest issues that exist on current affairs matters across the globe. It can be cultural, political or social issues, but we'll try to deal with them head on. All too often what we find is establishment tropes and all sorts of narratives which are based on censorship, self-censorship and rules and regulations which are increasingly reducing people's freedom to say what they want, how they want and when they want. So the entire purpose of the program ultimately is to give you and your opinion a greater truth narrative and to project that. Please do like, subscribe and punch those buttons so that we can get this message out further and further. As far as today's show goes, we're going to deal with something very, very pernicious. This notion of the rights of human beings, especially in democracies, to be able to say what they want and say it how they want, is increasingly being terminated. It's being tackled in a way by the politicians, by the media, and by professional agencies in a way which sounds increasingly like we might as well be living in a totalitarian surveillance capitalism kind of state. And maybe that's exactly where we are. In the studio today, I have Dr. Rehiana Ali. Welcome to the show, Rehiana.
Thank you very much.
And we also have Brother Barry Grossman, who's a lawyer, an international lawyer. And we're focusing on the specific case of Dr. Rehiana Ali here, who has been subjected to what she would describe, or anybody perhaps neutral, she'd argue, would describe as a witch hunt against certain views she held, or certain statements she made, tweets she put out regarding supposedly proscribed terrorist organizations, according to the British establishment and a lot of the other Western establishments. And this is something which is not new. It's been happening increasingly to people who are in the business of campaigning and protesting, in particular for Palestinian rights and for the Palestinian cause and against, obviously, Israel. Now, exceptionalism and Israel are two words which are often brought together, even in mainstream media, and have been discussed. But in your case, Dr. Rehiana, it seems fascinating that yet again, it's not the courts, it's not the British court system which seems to be giving you the primary problems here, but it seems like there are Israeli lobbies who have then combined with other institutions, most notably the medical
Council.
Yeah, the medical council, General Medical Council, and they've actually managed to make you essentially redundant for the foreseeable future, because you're under investigation, and that means you can't work and you can't do what you do, which is to heal and serve patients in the NHS. It seems very, very incredible that if charges haven't been proven, nothing's been proven, yet you're suspended and you can't serve the public because somebody objected to a set of tweets. Now, of course, I'll go into what their argument is as well in future, but first I want to talk about what it is that happened, what did you say, and what's been the reaction?
So I would say that I made perfectly legitimate and legal comment. So obviously when the issue of Palestine broke out, now I've not been very active on social media in my professional name until my brother was assassinated back in March 2022. So I set up a social media account. Now, but obviously for a long time, I've always believed in Palestine. I've always believed that Palestine has a right to regain its territory, all of it. I don't believe in Israel's right to exist. I'll be very upfront. These are views I've held for a long time, since I was a teenager. They haven't changed, and I've held them throughout my professional life, and I've held them, and I think I have been proven correct, as we've seen Israel's behaviour, particularly over the last, 450 odd days. And I think more and more people are increasingly coming to the views that I've held. But in terms of this witch hunt, you mentioned obviously that it's not the courts. Precisely. I think these lobbies are using the regulatory bodies to try and punish people who dare to basically put forward an anti-Israel viewpoint. And that's exactly what it is. My tweets have all been anti-Israel and anti-Israeli, which I think I'm perfectly entitled to have. But they have decided that they are going to punish me for holding these views.
Well, before I interrogate you on what the do's and rights and wrongs or do's and don'ts of this are, what was the specific tweet that they've taken issue with?
So they've had a whole collection of tweets. So those tweets referred to the one that they particularly putting forward in a number of articles. So I think I've been the subject of probably at least 7 or 8 articles that I know of in probably the last 6 weeks. And that's really across the pro-Israeli press, or the marked pro-Israeli press. So we're talking about the Jewish News, the Jewish Chronicle, if you can call them press, and the Telegraph, for example, and also the Jerusalem Post. And these have all basically largely focused on a tweet that I put out, which they are misconstruing and deliberately misquoting to try and make it out that I have lent support to a prescribed terrorist group. Now, as a Cambridge-educated doctor, I'm not stupid. So I understand that it's illegal to express support for an organisation that's been prescribed. However, it's not illegal to, number one, question whether that organisation should have been prescribed in the first place. But actually the tweet itself stated that when, Sinwar was assassinated, my tweet said, Israel has made a mistake. They've turned Sinwar into a legend. Now, this is a perfectly accurate political commentary, and I think I've been proven correct. So, and the example I gave of that was that obviously throughout the Arab world, there were teenagers sitting on an armchair, miming what Sinwar's last act of resistance was, and his last act of resistance was that these Israelis could not kill him, basically take him on one-to-one, man-to-man. They basically sent an airstrike to kill one man. And rather than it being perceived as their victory, throughout the Arab world and elsewhere, it was seen as a cowardly act, that they couldn't actually kill a man, directly. They had to send an airstrike to kill him. And still, he managed, despite having an arm amputated, he basically threw something at the drone. And throughout the Arab world, that action was basically mimicked, and the videos were created about it on social media. Not only that, there's America's Got Talent. Somebody sang a tribute to Sinwar, okay, on America's Got Talent. On top of that, there's the Bad Boys Club, which is selling T-shirts. These are white Americans selling T-shirts, calling Sinwar a legend. So my political commentary was spot on. I said that actually Israel had turned someone who was, the leader of a resistance group, but from someone who was probably not recognized, to basically a martyr amongst the Palestinians, and also a legend actually in the Arab world and throughout even within America amongst white Americans. So it's perfectly legitimate. So what they did was their headlines are, she described Sinwar as a legend. I would say that linguistically that's it's inaccurate, or that she eulogized him, or she supports Hamas. Now, at no point have I expressed that support, because that would be illegal. in this so-called democracy that we live in. I would question whether it's a democracy or not, but the point is that I did not.
Well, absolutely fascinating. I could pick up all sorts of points in terms of the Israeli lobby and the general stand which it seems the media has taken, that they're going to defend Israel at all costs and to effectively dumb down any criticism. In fact, the latest headlines seem to be talking about a BBC gentleman, a BBC employee who's literally been outed as a kind of a supporter of Israel, a supporter of
and a former Mossad agent, I think.
Yeah, and yet we've got no pull up there. But actually, on these incidents, we're finding that they're going to town and listening to often lobby groups in a way which is disproportionate and unfair. This is the argument. They, I guess, would argue that no, this is anti-Semitism, that what you're doing is riling up hatred for Israel, and that is unacceptable. Were you doing that? Was that your intention? So
the question I would then ask is, why is it not legitimate to have hatred for Israel? So I don't consider Israel a legitimate country. I don't consider it a nation. I've said this many times. I don't consider it a state. So I object to people when they say, well, Israel is a country, it's a state. I don't define it as that. I define it as a fake construct, a fake temporary construct, called Israel. I say it's a terrorist entity. And it should be dismantled.
But it's a legitimate. It's a nation state. It's been given legitimacy by the United Nations. So
sure, but during that vote, when they voted to create the existence of Israel, not a single Arab nation voted for it. So again, I think that premise on which Israel has been accepted, can be questioned. I could legitimately question, the existence of even the UK. I could say that France owns the UK. Britain has no right to exist. I could be as inflammatory as I would like, and nobody would bat an eyelid. Right. But as soon as you get to criticizing Israel, okay, hell breaks loose. And that's exactly what happened, because this wasn't the first complaint. This is the fourth complaint to the GMC about me. The first three, and this is what's interesting, the first three were dismissed as baseless by the General Medical Council. So it was obviously those were correct decisions. It wasn't one, it was three. And I had lobby groups, so particularly vitriolic lobby groups. So we're talking the UK Lawyers for Israel. I would question, why are there lawyers for Israel in the UK? That would be my argument. Ganasha Jew, for example, they reported to me, and I think in February, the GMC dismissed it. I got a letter saying that they looked at it, there was nothing, they dismissed it as baseless. Then I had the Jewish Medical Association report me when I stood for the parliamentary elections in July. They reported me, I found out later, twice, again, on my election flyer. So I am a candidate who's standing in a UK parliamentary election, and they are interfering with UK democratic processes. Right. By having an issue with my flyer, which the Electoral Commission has no issue with. Okay, so we'll come on to this, your political your activism that's happened as well, and how that perhaps rolled into this. But Barry, of course, this is that thorny area where it's a reality that Jewishness, being a Jew, Judaism, Israel, and Zionism are all conflated quite often to create storms, to highlight people who might have the wrong opinions on this. And of course, Jeremy Corbyn, I would argue, of the Labour Party is the classic case of somebody who was arguably witch hunted by the same groups, and the Labour Party has fundamentally changed after that entire campaign, and literally arguably also made sure that Labour didn't win any votes during Corbyn's time because of a lot of his stands for what some would describe as justice for Palestine. So first of all, homing in on Rehana's case specifically, I know you haven't had the real absolute details, but as a lawyer, what's your initial impression of this? And as also somebody who is very keenly aware of Israeli exceptionalism, as it's often described from some quarters.
Well, what I'd start with is this, and that is that the GMC obviously has the right to regulate the profession. And when it comes to what would otherwise seem to be statements made by people that have nothing to do with medicine, the interest, the concern that they're entitled to take action over is if somebody says something which objectively can be seen as bringing the profession into disrepute, or secondly, substantially affecting public confidence in the medical profession. So then when we look at the specifics, of course, of Rehiana's case, right away we start to see all the usual stuff. And if we were to turn this around a little bit, for example, one could ask, well, does it not bring the medical profession into disrepute that it has connections with all of these special interest groups and lobby groups from Israel? Does it not bring the profession into disrepute that in many regards it, like so many other institutions in the United Kingdom, supports the Israeli claim that it has a right to defend itself and a right to exist and so forth? Because the world is seeing, and we're not talking about the lunatic fringe coming out here and saying without any expertise that what Israel is doing, involves war crimes and is a genocide. We're talking about the most capable people in the world that have built an entire professional career around the issue, saying that this is very clearly a genocidal war. And of course, they pretend that there's no consensus about what genocide means in this particular application, and they try and invoke this image of a war that tries to literally line people up against the walls and exterminate every last one of them. But of course, the term genocide is very clearly defined in the Genocide Convention, and it's very clear about what sort of action is considered genocidal and illegal in international law, and it's also a crime for any nation and presumably any organization within another nation to lend support to.
But Barry, what interests me here is that there's a sort of appropriation of terminology and language going on, because on the one hand, let me draw out one example that comes to mind, is that when we talk about Islamic extremism, this was very common all across the British media and the Western media. Islamic extremism was a very acceptable term, so pigeonholing an entire faith and putting the label extremism on wasn't a problem for the Western media. It seems that when you say Jewish extremism, that would be an awfully big problem. You don't hear that term on the same media, let alone in the political circles. It's almost like Jewish extremism is not allowed, to be even considered. You see, it's these kinds of hypocrisies and disparities that I want.
There's quite clearly a long history of not only Jewish extremism but Jewish terrorism. In fact, the original illegal migrants to Palestine, who lobbied the British to allow them to set up a Jewish state. They invented terrorism when they bombed the King David Hotel and railways and did all manner of other things that on any view.
But if you say that, if you say that, Barry, you say that's Jewish terrorism, Jewish extremism. We're straight into the territory of anti-Semitism. We're straight into the territory of the legislature and all of the other bodies, institutional bodies, begin to sort of turn on whoever says anything like that, and there would be a huge hue and cry. Not only that, of course, you'll get the litigation. But let me come on to Rehiana again. I mean, Barry's made some sound points, but I'm going to continue with this line of terminology and ownership of certain vocabulary. Let's bring the vocabulary of the Holocaust, for instance. It's almost like the minute you use the word Holocaust for, say, the Gazans, or if you were to use the word Holocaust for any other incident, it's almost unacceptable. It's not used in that context.
So when I was attacked for the election flyer by the Jewish Medical Association, that's precisely the word they picked on. So the very first statement on my manifesto was that I would want to end the Holocaust in Palestine. In fact, I think my sister and myself were probably the first to use the term, as far as I know, because it wasn't widespread across X, and I think later people began to pick it up, because it's the accurate term, because the Holocaust refers not just to the mass killing of people, but actually literally refers to people being burnt to death. And what have we seen in Gaza? Tents being set on fire. It's a literal definition of a Holocaust. So they objected to my use of the word Holocaust, and, you know, with real chutzpah, they actually said that, you know, whilst the deaths of Palestinians were tragic, so there's an ongoing Holocaust, and that's the terminology they use. And this is a medical organization. And to be honest, I was quite taken aback by that, because, you know, these were supposedly my fellow colleagues, and I, you know, who were using this language. And I would question the ability of anyone to practice medicine if with that mindset, when you can ignore what is probably, you know, in excess of 150,000 deaths, because I don't accept there's 40,000 deaths, because those are only counted figures in Palestine.
Yeah, the Lancet figures are about 180,000 at least.
Absolutely, but everyone keeps, you know, talking about the 40,000 figure. And those are counted numbers of people who probably arrived in hospital and have been counted.
But did you, when you used the word Holocaust, were you doing it consciously as a way of taking away from the established understanding of a Holocaust, i.e. Auschwitz and the German Nazi concentration camps?
I don't believe the word is trademarked. So, you know, the word is not trademarked for one particular event. You know, so these individuals can deny this Holocaust, and yet one particular event in history is sacrosanct. I take issue with that. And I take issue because, you know, when I stood on the election platform, I said I was a free speech absolutist. And that means that I don't mind if people want to discuss the Quran, if people want to discuss Muslims, that's fine. I say go ahead and discuss it, because I can rebut those arguments. I'll defend Islam, and I'll defend, you know, anything you want to say about me. But likewise and equally, other people should have that same privilege to go and basically, you know, respond. But it seems that actually only one group gets a privilege, and I do believe there's a Jewish privilege, and it's by virtue of, you know, this one event that happened, you know, in the 1940s, and no one is allowed to question it. So whilst it's not a crime, it's not against the law in the UK for the moment, in 19 countries of the world, you cannot question any event regarding the Holocaust. You cannot question the gas chambers, you can't question any story, you can't question the numbers. And my issue as a free speech absolutist is, why can people not question it? Because
well, David Irving was a very famous author back when I was growing up, and he was slammed beyond all recognition. He did some very let's say, cutting-edge work around Nazism and the history, and his rewriting of history got him into an extraordinary boycotting and censorship scenario. I think he died in that situation.
No, he's still alive. He's still alive.
Is he alive? I thought he.
No, he's still alive, but he's obviously unwell. But my issue with my issue.
What's the difference between, say, what you're arguing and what Irving would have argued?
Well, David Irving has, you know, again, he hasn't denied there were deaths in the Auschwitz camps. You know, he's questioned obviously the narrative, and he's questioned, you know, so he was a well-celebrated historian in the UK. It was well lauded. You know, his books were, you know, published piecemeal in, for example, I think the Times, if I recall correctly, until he wrote his book on Adolf Hitler. Now, his view, you know, his ability was to basically take primary sources and use those as a basis for his, you know, dissection of what was happening. And, you know, he had access, and he knew that British had broken the code, the German code from 1942. So he had legitimate questions that from 1942 to 1945, they had access to everything the Germans were saying, right? And there was no mention of any death camps, you know, in those codes, and they would have talked about it. He said, you know, and so one of the tweets that they picked up on for me was that I had reposted a short video clip from David Irving, right? And David Irving had produced a small video, and he had said that for, I don't know how many years, 20 odd years, he'd carried £1,000 in his pocket. And he said if anyone could provide him with a primary source document to show that Hitler was aware of any death camps in Auschwitz, he would give that £1,000. And he said it's never been claimed. So all I did was I reposted and I said, that's strange, Suddenly strange became very anti-Semitic. And I had basically, dared, repost a Holocaust denier. And my view is this, that, David Irwin has said, I think, unpleasant things about Muslims, for example, and brown people and whatnot. And my take is this, that's his opinion. He's entitled to it. As a free speech absolutist, you can't be hypocritical in your views. Let him have his view, and I have mine. But if he's accurate, if he's making a valid point, I have no issue with retweeting it. Maybe some people do, and they don't want to. If they're Asian and they don't want to retweet, David Irwin, that's fine. That's their business. I don't take issue. My issue is I think facts speak for themselves. And as I said to the Telegraph in one of my comments, facts can never be anti-Semitic. Right, and I also take the line that truth never fears investigation. So I have not gone into the Holocaust necessarily into my tweets, but the point is, because I've been focusing obviously on the current Holocaust, the live ongoing Holocaust in Palestine, but I don't have an issue with people questioning events, because that's exactly what we should do. We should use our critical faculties to look at any event, and why should one event be exempt from that? Because
just to draw a parallel again, in case people are thinking that it's a sort of a targeting of Jewish sensitivities or Jewish rights here. I mean, as a Muslim, there were, of course, Charlie Hebdo. There were cartoons about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. There was Salman Rushdie and his book Satanic Verses, and his take on a fictional take on the Prophet and his family, etc., his wives, and of course those were hugely objectionable takes that British literature and publishers and the establishment and the politicians all supported. And of course, they hurt the sensibilities of an entire people across the world, but it didn't seem to matter. By and large, it went through. Barry, I want to bring you in on this. That the charge of anti-Semitism, the charge of hating Jews, is levelled very, very quickly when anybody raises issues about Israel's behaviour. It's so kind of almost it's so interrelated and so kind of overlapping as far as Western media is concerned and the political infrastructure is concerned. Is it something that we should self-censor because we're going to get in trouble by the looks of things every time we mention that term? Are we into the realm of, well, we should just surrender and self-censor and not be like Dr. Rehiana and stand up for freedom of speech, absolutism, as she puts it?
I wish it was as simple as that, but let me back up a little bit to something you said a moment ago in equating anti-Semitism with hating Jews. That's not what anti-Semitism means, and I don't think it ever necessarily has meant that, but it's even worse than that. It isn't that long ago now that the Zionist lobby managed to get Webster's, the international edition, the second version of it, to redefine anti-Semitism, to include a whole new part that said any criticism of Israel or support for its enemies is also anti-Semitism. So again, it's one of those words which we see anybody connected with the hegemon, with the Zionists, and with this with the Americans, they basically fiddle with the words like they do with national interest and terrorism and everything else. So we don't want to get bogged down in semantics. But on the other side of the coin, I think we do have to sometimes be a little bit careful. For example, I see absolutely no reason for us to get involved in this European debate about a European problem. Namely, what was the Holocaust? Who knew about it? Who did and didn't try to do something about it, and everything else. That was a European problem, and certainly to the extent the Americans got involved, they didn't intervene any more than the British or any other allies did to stop it when they became aware that there was something going on. On the other hand, most Palestinians, being part of mandatory Palestine, to the extent they got involved in fighting on behalf of the Allies. Yet here we have this nut job, Netanyahu, almost twice a year making a speech claiming that Palestinians were responsible for the Holocaust, that it was Palestinians who put the idea in Hitler's mind and pressured him into carrying out the Holocaust, which is absolute lunacy.
What was his evidence for that, Barry? I mean, if he's saying it
well,
on...
Of course he doesn't give evidence. He just says it, and he said it repeatedly, publicly. This is not something, you know, that's out there on the dark net or something. He says it quite openly. He says it in his tweets. You know, another thing worth remembering, of course, is the predecessor to the Likud party, the original party, was a revisionist party that admired Mussolini and Mussolini fascists and were very much connected with them. And of course, if we look at the scholarly work done by Israelis that have exposed the existence of something they call the transfer agreement between Nazi Germany and the international Zionism, you know, to promote trade, as long as the ultimate aim was to get Jews out of Europe and out of Germany. And if we look at the original diaries of Herschel, that's supposedly the founding father of Israel, when he calls on other Jews to humiliate Jews to the point and basically abuse them and steal from them and do whatever it takes to make them ashamed to be settling for integration so that they'll just leave everything behind and go and live in Palestine, then a whole different picture emerges. But I don't think there's anything for us to be gained, given that most people are firmly fixed in their views about some of these historical tragedies. To be talking about,
Rehiana, can I just come back on that? So the issue is not about whether people are fixated on that view. The issue is whether people have a right to question that view. So so my point is that on any other
event... If I can say this, Rehiana, if I may say this, people have a right to say what they want and bear the consequences of it. And you as a physician, I would encourage you, you're a very intelligent person, the movement needs you. Don't give them ammo, even though it shouldn't be ammo, that makes their campaign against you all the more effective.
I'm not giving anyone ammunition. I'm making one very clear point, and I think it needs to be made because, you know, the issue here very much is that, you know, I don't believe people should set the parameters of any discussion. So the point I have made is that you can question any other event except one. So that is as far as that is the only point I need to make. So I don't think we need to go into the details of whether a Havara agreement existed or not, and whether the Jewish people were made to leave their stuff behind. I mean, that's actually, you know, extraneous detail here that we don't need. What I'm talking about is why is one event, you know, completely immune from any scrutiny. So you can question it. This is a right of historians.
And we all know the answer to that question.
Right. So all the more, so I believe all the more reason that it should be questioned, and it can be questioned. And I don't have an issue with people who want to go and open up, you know, go down that road.
Okay, Dr. Rehiana, then the next phase is quite often what I'm seeing. For instance, let's take Palestine Action as a group which fights Elbit and other corporations which are responsible, they say, for the murder, and they are. They're weapons industries which are killing Gazan children. There's no dispute with that. That's a fact. But by taking certain actions, does it not stoke the fuel? Does it not give more ammunition to these lobby groups to be able to go to Parliament and go to these other institutions and demand even more restriction of the rights? I mean, that's the argument that some people would put. So by you being even more demanding the right that you have, will it make these lobby groups work even harder to restrict freedom even more?
So let me kind of give you a response to that. So my response to that would be that by making that argument, you would say, well, okay, well, in that case, vast majority of people never push back. But actually, we've seen a massive restriction, basically, in our free speech despite that. So I would say that actually we have every duty to preserve whatever free speech we've got left and actually not have it taken away from us, because that's exactly what's happened. Now, Palestine Action, you know, yes, they are accused of causing criminal damage, okay? But the reason Palestine Action were formed was because there was a complete inaction from the various other Palestinian groups who can go to marches, and I applaud marches, I've been to many, but the point is, you know, the massacres and the genocide has continued. So these people are very conscientious individuals, and they want to see the massacre and slaughter of kids particularly end. And that is, you know, so there is a justification in law. Now, it is Britain which is basically not abiding by, you know, the rulings of the ICJ, you know, which clearly says that, you know, a state has to do everything within its possible to not assist in the genocide and to stop it happening. And that's precisely what's not been happening. So if anyone could be accused of breaking the law, it would be the UK government. And in fact, you could say, well, there'd be no need for Palestine Action if the UK government followed international law. So it's the UK government that I would say that is probably, you know, the criminal here, or the terrorist, if you like. And I'm quite willing to say that. Why can I not say that? And Palestine Action are trying to bring them to account.
So let's come on to your political campaign, because there you obviously went very public, and you had in Bradford, I think it was where you stood, and up against you were the Labour Party and all the traditional fraternity there. Was it clear that your stance, I mean, or did your stance on Israel and your stance for Palestinians become the main focal point of your campaign? Was that what you were fighting for? Was that? So
the reason, so I'll backtrack a little bit because I think it gives context. So I, you know, was already thinking of standing as a parliamentary candidate, and that was because I had personal experience. I had no desire to be let's be clear, I had no desire to be in the House of Commons. Okay, most of them are crooks. So I had no desire to be there. I was quite content to be, you know, a consultant neurologist. But I had personal experience of all the Bradford MPs, particularly in regards to my brother's assassination case in Islamabad. And not a single MP would assist me. You know, so we're talking here now about Imran Hussain in Bradford East, who was my uncle's MP. We're talking Richard Bergen, who was my MP at the time in Leeds East. We're talking Naz Shah in Bradford West, my sister's MP, my parents' MP, Judith Cummings. Not a single MP would help. They were completely outrageous and atrocious despite what we've been going through. So that was one. When October the 7th happened and there was complete silence from these MPs about, you know, the massacres you were seeing daily, I have never been more outraged that there was such silence, and I was angry, okay? And I am someone who doesn't, I rarely shed tears, but the number of times you are scarred by these images of, you know, kids with their limbs blown off or their heads blown off, you know, these images are so marked, and yet these MPs could not speak and did not speak. And, you know, I thought, you know, this cannot continue. So I decided I ideally would have liked to have stood in Bradford West. You know, Naz Shah was a sitting duck, I believe, to be taken out. But there was already a candidate there, and you know, that's probably a conversation for another time about the type of politics we have in the Bradford, you know, Muslim community, or the Muslim community generally in the UK. But so I decided to stand in Bradford South and challenge Judith Cummings, who'd been an MP for 9 years. And if you'd asked the vast majority of the local population, the answer would be she had done nothing. She's not known for anything, not a single achievement, apart from putting forward a bill that didn't get taken up to ban fireworks at night. You know, that's the sum achievement of 9 years of work.
Well, she's a constituency. Surely she did things for people in Bradford.
I really did not meet a single individual, and I did canvass, who said many. Obviously, some people may have had good experiences with her, but she was basically a missing MP.
Okay, so regarding this particular, your case, and particularly the issue of dealing with Gaza, you clearly had an issue with them. Now, reasons for why they may not have been so vocal. I know for a fact that Naz Khan was attacked by the same media that seems to be attacking you because of one. She liked a tweet.
She reposted.
She reposted a map.
Yes, she reposted basically of Israel being, you know, moved over to the United States, another state of the United States of America. Now, Naz Shah, obviously to preserve her own career, decided that, you know, she would fulsomely, you know, apologize and, you know, beg for forgiveness from the lobby. And for that, you know, she's been rewarded by being supported in her, endeavours, and she's now obviously, I think, lost that integrity. She has been very quiet, largely, apart from when she's pushed on the Palestine issue. And I take issue with that, because that to me shows a lack of moral fibre. There was nothing wrong with that original tweet. In fact, I think it's pretty mild, right? Because I've actually said Israel doesn't have a right to exist on Palestinian land. And I think that, before she plants, Israel onto America, you see, I'm a Democrat. I think you should ask the American people, do you want Israel as part of your country? Okay, or do you want to give away a piece of your land? Because I'm a Democrat, okay, and I'm democratic in how I perceive things. So I don't have a problem, I don't have a problem with Israel existing elsewhere. Why would I? But it needs to go find somewhere that's not taken up by an indigenous population, and it has to accept that the people around it, given what people have seen of how Israelis behave, would you really want them as your neighbour?
Well, Rehiana, of course, we're again steering into territory where if I was a Zionist, if I was an Israeli, if I was a pro-Israel lobbyist, I'd be immediately shouting anti-Semitic. She wants the destruction of Israel, the dismantlement of Israel, which means that she's anti-Jewish as well. Barry, it goes round in cycles, doesn't it? It seems that the politicians we've touched on are also scared by the looks of things. I mean, of course, I mentioned Jeremy Corbyn and what happened to him. Is it that these lobbies, with their power, can end up making examples of people, whether they're politicians or medical practitioners or, builders, whoever says something which is against Israel's interests or the interests of what they regard as global Zionism, basically you're going to get the same treatment. Is it just something that we've got to, swallow and say, yes, this is the reality. They are in power. They are in ascendancy. They control the levers of power. They maybe have enough finances to be able to force these institutions to do what they want? Or is it that institutionally, nations like Britain and America are fundamentally part of that system? Is it that the lobby groups don't have to try very hard, that the institutions here themselves are already sold on the idea of needing Israel and supporting it no matter what, regardless of any common sense or any legal scenario in one shape or form? Are we just faced with that hard reality and we've just got to live with it?
Well, no, again, I don't think anything is ever that simple of choosing between A and B. All I can really say in general terms to answer your point is this. This is what an international rules-based order which in fact has no rules is like. This is what it's like living in an authoritarian state with a security apparatus that has unlimited power and is fully insulated through legislation from being held accountable or being prosecuted even for committing the most heinous crimes like murder, which is what most Atlantic world countries have done. They passed legislation granting that kind of absolute immunity. And of course, like Rehiana, I don't think Israel has the right to exist. There's other things I would say that I don't want to tarnish your show with in terms of who I support and who I don't. But I'm one of these people who's been saying for a couple of decades that the only way forward is through armed resistance. And of course, it's
which is a right of the Palestinians. That
an occupied people have an inalienable right to engage in armed resistance. It was a cause that was certainly worthy of celebration as heroic when the French did it, and when the Greeks did it, and when a handful of Italians and some Dutch did it. So why all of a sudden? And of course, it was something that the state itself did. The CIA with the security apparatuses of various European states.
But Barry, do you also, and as my friend Piers Morgan might say, do you also give Israel, support Israel's right to defend itself equally?
It has no right to defend itself, let alone on occupied territory. Zero right. And in fact, the proper legal response, given the status that it's somehow managed to cheat the world into giving to it, the proper legal, the proper response would have been to bring it up with the United Nations, with the Palestinian Authority and the elected government of Gaza, and demand that they do something about that incursion. Okay, they didn't have a right to go storming across the border and then basically carry out this massive campaign of destroying all infrastructure and bombing everything until there's nothing left, killing hundreds of thousands of people.
So they were essentially killing their own citizens, because
it's a violation from law to go.
Aren't the Gazans essentially part of the Israeli state, and therefore weren't they attacking their own citizens technically? Is that the legal position, or am I wrong on that?
No. Gaza is in no way part of the Israeli state, as it's recognized, and neither is the West Bank. To the extent that the Israeli security apparatus operates in the West Bank, it's a result of the Oslo Accords and concessions that were made, notwithstanding that Israel didn't follow through by sticking with its own commitments. And I find it really quite astounding that people like Abbas and the Palestinian Authority continue to allow the Israeli security apparatus to operate in that way, given that they long ago renounced the Oslo Accords. It's time to burn those damn things, throw them away, and sweep the ashes out of the room and get on with things.
Okay, Barry, that clarifies that point.
In the West Bank.
That clarifies that nicely for me. But let me draw it back to we're coming to the end of the show, and I want to draw it back to the original case that we started focusing on. We've seen the context, and there's a huge amount to take in about what's going on, why you might be subjected to the kind of inquisition, I guess you'd argue.
So I would take issue with the fact that I should be subjected to it, because number one, all my tweets are perfectly legitimate and legal. Now, it's the very fact that I am actually speaking out as a humanitarian against what's happening in Palestine, that actually I should be applauded. That actually, it's a moral conscience, and it should be the stated position of every doctor. We are against the mass slaughter. It is the Jewish Medical Association, a doctor who clearly has, whether you want to call it Zionist views, who reported me, seems to be a member of the Jewish Medical Association, who reported me, conflating my criticism of Israel and Israeli behavior as anti-Jewish hatred. Not one single tweet of the very many they collected. It's a laughable collection, what they've collected, and said that this is anti-Jewish hatred. I have been a medic for almost 21 years. Okay, I have never had a single patient complaint. So this has nothing to do with patients. And my view,
in what way would it harm patients? Your political view on this? What's their argument?
So they are saying that I am bringing the GMC into disrepute. The point I would make is how possibly, in fact, actually, the GMC should be proud to have people who are willing to speak out against genocide. So actually, it's bizarre this organization is willing to meet with lobbies and bringing itself into disrepute.
Rehiana, what's the GMC's position on hospitals being bombed in Gaza?
Well, that's a good thing. They have had a stated position.
I mean, those are doctors. They're people working in hospitals. And it's very clear that those hospitals have been attacked.
Just on that point, so one of the tweets, and I will say this because I will defend this tweet to the hilt. I said after the Israelis, Mossad, blew up the pages in Lebanon, those pages were being used by healthcare professionals in Lebanon, as well. Okay, so nurses and doctors were using them. They exploded in marketplaces, and I made the comment that actually, the Israelis could not be trusted. They could not be trusted basically with tech. They could not be trusted with healthcare. They could not be trusted with anything really, actually. And I would boycott everything Israeli, and I stand by that. And I say that because to blow up pages in marketplaces, to blow up pages, used by my international colleagues, is a sign that there is no morality, if you like.
If ISIS were to do that, would that be terrorism?
Of course it would. It would be clear.
If Al Qaeda were to do it,
on that subject, if I can say this,
well, maybe not now in Syria.
But Barry, yes, it's a good point. Barry,
I just want to throw this into the blender. I mean, there has been a number of British doctors who've lodged a complaint with the International Medical Association against the Israeli Medical Association, saying that basically they should be removed as being members from the global profession, citing all the usual reasons that we all know only too well. But let's also not forget, if we want to talk about ethics and bringing things into disrepute, it was the Israelis who were providing, among other things, medical assistance to ISIL in Syria not that many years ago, and all sorts of other support as well. And how does one compare that?
Israel, of course, they say that those guys in hospitals are not actually doctors. They're also H group operatives. They'll argue that they are also terrorists. And as far as they're concerned, whether they're medical staff or not, they just fob it off with this, with no evidence, of course, and no need to substantiate. Journalists aren't allowed into Gaza, so they can't verify if these hospitals, these doctors or these medics are real ones or not. So everybody just has to take what the IDF and the Israeli establishment say on this. But final point to you, Rehiana, before I let Barry make a conclusion as well. You in one of your tweets, I picked up the case of a professor in UCL, Katz, I believe. Yeah. Tell me about that, because that draws an interesting parallel, the way you've been treated by your profession, and then the thing which Mr. Katz put out there in regard to Israel and his opinions around that. It doesn't seem as though his university profession have done a great deal about that. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So I think this is actually the point I was making about double standards. The double standards are being applied. Humanitarians, those with moral conscience, are being subjected to sanctions or worse, and those who basically are well established, if you like, in the medical profession. So David Katz is an emeritus professor at UCL. I think there are issues in his background. So there was an article that was published on Substack that looks into his background, and I think there are questions to be asked about some of the work he has gone back and done in Israel. And he also has, as soon as October the 7th happened, he began to talk about rising levels of anti-Semitism, okay? And he has called NHS health workers, so technically his colleagues, bigots for wearing a Palestinian badge. Now, that didn't cause the GMC any concern, that he's basically offended, thousands of NHS staff. Not only that, I think there's a very significant concern about his, he has given talks at Chabad. Now, people may not know what Chabad is. Chabad seems to be a very extreme Talmudist Jewish group. And they hold, their leader was, Menachem Schneerson. Menachem Schneerson is known for quotes such as, non-Jewish people don't have satanic souls, okay? And only Jewish people are human beings. And
they are the most powerful, by the way, they are the most powerful Zionist Jewish grouping in America. I know that much.
It was that Chabad group where the people may not remember the story, this happened last year, where underneath a synagogue, there were tunnels, for example, being found, and stained mattresses. And that story went out the limelight. So this professor has basically given talks at Chabad, an extremist Jewish group that holds the view that non-Jewish people are not equal to Jewish people. Now, isn't that very concerning? Because not once, my view is the opposite. Everyone is equal. I don't treat anyone differently. But he is going to events, or is going to events held by a group that hold these very extremist views. Now, one would make a logical assumption, does he share them? Because he's going to those events. I wouldn't associate with an extremist group. And not only that, he's giving talks where he talks of vaccines, and he's saying odd statements of, the Jews will make rules for non-Jews. Seems a very odd statement to make. And so I think that, and yet he has sat, this is what also is very concerning, he has sat on, the staff committee at the BMA, he's sat on tribunals, he's sat at the GMC, he's done various work for the GMC, and he's sat on tribunals. So my question then becomes, if he's associated with Chabad and he's sat on tribunals, how many people has he sanctioned? Okay, and has he sanctioned them differently based on whether they're Jewish or non-Jewish? These questions need to be asked. And I think that article asked the question, well, do the GMC and the MPTS now need to reassess all the cases that he has sat at? Has he behaved fairly? Because he has been at these extremist events. And I think these are legitimate questions. So we're being treated very, very differently because I believe there's an issue. And this is the one thing that I'm against privilege of any group. And what there seems to be in this country is Jewish privilege. Privilege extended to one group, but not to anyone else. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And I'm an anti-supremacist. That's my political standpoint. And I think that should make me a far.
So you'd be against Muslim privilege, against Christian privilege, or
of course.
female privilege.
Yeah, of course. I'm for meritocracy.
Right.
I actually don't believe in any privilege for any group. Okay, and I think there should be a level playing field, and there clearly is not. And the question that I think what the GMC has done is it's brought itself, I think, into a dispute. It should be independent of politicians. It should be independent of lobbies. The only people who've attacked me, it's not a patient making a complaint about my clinical care. No one has complained about my care in 21 years. My views haven't changed. So the fact that if I suddenly now get a complaint, it's obviously going to be political. These complaints are politically motivated. You called it a witch hunt. It's a political persecution of how dare you hold views that we don't find acceptable. And I say, well, every single tweet I've done has been legal and legitimate, and I will not be changing them. And I think that is exactly the viewpoint that most people should take. And it's a difficult line to take, but it should be taken because these people have no right to dictate what a UK citizen can say.
What's the worst they can do to you, Rehiana? And what's the future? Where are you going to go with this?
So, well, immediately, obviously, the whole basis. So, the rapidity at which I was referred to the interim order tribunal. So the GMC, when it received the complaint, should have actually asked me for some kind of comment. It didn't do that. It made a decision that I was no risk to patients, but it was going to go to a tribunal on public interest grounds. It gave me practically no time to prepare. The first hearing it wanted to have was giving me 9 days when I had double clinics booked to basically address these concerns. How was I meant to find a representative? How was I meant to find a lawyer within that time frame if I was working from 7:30 in the morning till 7 or 8 in the evening? And when it did move the date, there was no urgency. I had not killed a patient. I had not done any harm. And yet the fact that I had offended Israelis, offended Israeli opinion, was basically more urgent than anything else. So now something like 200 patients are probably being cancelled in January. British patients. That should be the priority of the GMC. It's British patients and our public, our NHS service. And yet they've basically tried to put Israeli interests first. So my election flyer, is very relevant to this because my slogan was, it should be Britain first, not Israel first.
Well, on that note, I'm going to have to conclude the discussion, an absolutely fascinating, very critical discussion. Often, of course, we're not allowed to have this on mainstream media because we're touching all those nerve endings which seem to make certain people in our hierarchy very, very nervous, and I think that it's a discussion that should be had. I think that free speech is free speech. If we're going to start doctoring people and if we're going to censor people without giving them any real recourse to being able to air their views in public, whether it's in the political circles or within the media, it is a real problem for us and something that the whole of society needs to think about very carefully. Thank you very much, Barry Grossman, international lawyer out there in Bali. And of course, thank you, Dr. Rehiana, for such a detailed analysis. And of course, there were some tough questions that one had to ask, and we did. And I guess if somebody wants to accuse us of anti-Semitism, well, what we're going to do is give you the platform. Please come and give us your take on why Dr. Rehiana Ali should be treated in the way that she is, and for exactly the tweets. And perhaps that's going to be the next program. Maybe Rehiana will come back and actually have a chat with one of those forces or individuals or institutions which is trying to essentially finish her career. That's what it seems to me to be. Again, thank you for watching this edition of Deep Dive Perspective. Like, share and subscribe, and look forward to seeing you on the next edition.